It's 25 years since Bernie joined the Ancestors, enriched the Ancestors, and I think there's probably few, I was going to say better, but certainly more important places for us to have this gathering today than in Parliament, because Bernie made people really uncomfortable in Parliament, didn't he? Quite rightly, actually. Some of them needed to be made to feel uncomfortable. So the fact that we've got this gathering taking place today is, I think, really important. One of the points I want to make about tonight is that this isn't some kind of nostalgia trip where we're just meeting just to remember Bernie, as important as that is. This is about what we can do with the legacy that Bernie left us, with the issues that he raised in this place and the issues that he raised, frankly, across the globe. What is it that we can do to make sure people just don't just forget, but that people actually do something with it? The task isn't just to remember and to be theoretical about things. The task is to move to action, isn't it? To actually do something, to make sure that a difference is made. And that's what tonight is all about. So we will look at some of the things that the Trust has been doing to try and make sure that that legacy isn't just remembered but acted upon. And we'll look to the future, and part of that discussion will be about what we all collectively can do together to take things forward. We are in, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, we are in seriously difficult times, where people are back to that old thing again of questioning whether many of us in this room should be here. Never mind in this room, but should be in this country again. Many of the people who look like many of the people in this room are being attacked on a daily basis. And that takes my memory back to those times in the 80s when many of us in this room campaigned with Bernie on the streets, but politically as well. And that, for me, is the kind of legacy that we need to think of today. And we need to take away with us from today into our communities, into our organisations. So what we'll do tonight is that we've got the brilliant Belle Ribeiro-Addy, who I'll say some more about later on when I introduce her. But we've also got a panel discussion as well, where we'll look at the website that we set up, and really pioneering stuff. And my friend Kurt here will lead that discussion for us. But the key, again, and I make no apologies for repeating this, the key isn't just to turn up here and just gather in a load of information. The key really is to think about what we all can do collectively to make sure that there is a real difference to the atmosphere, to the tension, to the whole kind of environment that seems to be back with us again in this country. So before we go any further, can I invite the Trust Secretary, Sharon Grant, to say a few words of welcome. So please welcome Sharon.
Much, Roger. My job is just to welcome you all. And there's some very particular welcomes that I think we need to give. First of all, can we welcome Diane Abbott? Bernie's partner in crime, can we say you are today? Yes, fair enough, okay. And also thanks to many many of you here are people that are participated in one way or another in various projects and campaigns that Bernie was involved in. There are too many of you to name, but it was obviously great that you're all here, and I hope you're all meeting up with some people you haven't seen for a while as well. Okay. And we want to thank the archivists at Bishopsgate. I don't know whether they are here. They were certainly coming, but if we wouldn't be able to launch this website on the digitisation project that we've been engaged in without the work that they have done, free of charge actually, to preserve the archive and to catalogue it so that we could in fact digitise it in the first place. So we appreciate the work that they've done. There are other people here, I think, from the world of archiving, and we're very glad that you've joined us today, and we hope that we'll see more of you in the future to discuss what I think ought to be a joint endeavour in terms of working together as Black Archives organisations to do the best that we can do to make Black history accessible to a wider number of people. We also need to thank the Heritage Lottery. I think there's a lady here, Carol, is she here? She was coming, but they've supported us in setting up the archive in the first place and a couple of small projects that we had. So may I say, perhaps we might talk to you again a little bit more in the future about some further funding, because there's a lot more that we can do here. Can we also thank Kelvin Okafor? Is he here? He's if you look at your leaflet, you'll see the amazing portrait on the front of the leaflet, which is a pencil and pen drawing, which currently hangs in Portcullis House across the road. He was the first artist to be commissioned by the Parliamentary Arts Department, the first black artist, and we know that it's a very popular viewing point for a lot of people that go over the road to Portcullis House. And he's agreed to allow us to use the portrait today and possibly for other purposes going forward. So we're grateful to him. Can I also acknowledge Bernie's family, who are here in some numbers, in particular his son, Alexander, and a couple of young ladies who never knew Bernie, but are clearly very proud of his record and his art. Somebody called Calvin Okafor has just arrived. Just acknowledge your contribution. Thank you so much for allowing us to use the portrait. Okay, but most importantly, I think for a number of us on the Trust Board, we've got a few young historians here. And we are very keen that the next generation has access to the material that we are presenting here through Digitising the Archive. We need to hand on that knowledge, as the Chair has said, and we can only do that by making the history, Black history, recent Black history, available to them, and to try to ensure that it's used for educational purposes. So we're very, very pleased to welcome those slightly younger looking people here today, as well as some of the older ones. And can I give a very special welcome to, I talked earlier about some of you having been involved in Bernie's projects. As many of you will know, one of the projects that he took forward involved trying to ensure that black artists and actors, etc., were not exploited in the way that they certainly were some years ago. And it was out of that that ideas about an art centre, a Bernie Grant Art Centre, developed. And one of those people that was part of those little caucuses in this building some years ago was Rudolph Walker. And I'm so glad that he's here with us today. Lovely to see you. But that's all from me. I'm going to leave it to the chair to introduce our star of the show today.
I think you can applaud. Yeah, I think we need to do a deal, right? I mean, this is mainly black people in the room, so we don't do quiet. When people kind of, make a contribution, we can kind of make some noise. I know this is Parliament; they're actually used to making noise in here, so don't be shy. Make some noise if you kind of want to. But I am sure as one of the younger people in the room, I'm claiming it, Sharon. Right, right. I'm not letting you get away with that. But it's my absolute honour to be able to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. So every year we do this lecture, and it's really, I think, one of the most inspirational things that I'm involved in every year. And it's no different tonight, where we've got, for me, one of the inspirational members of Parliament, as far as I'm concerned, one of the people we can rely on, along with Diane, to actually stand up and do the right thing and say the right things and to get out and campaign when it's needed. So the member, they've changed your constituency, the Tories did, didn't they? Am I supposed to say, I have to say, right, I got told off for being too political, just even on the way in to Parliament this evening. They took a load of my badges off me and everything, right, because it had things like CND, which is like controversial, apparently, that we shouldn't have nuclear weapons, but anyway. Can I introduce then the MP for Clapham and Brixton Hill, long-time friend of mine, and for me, as I've said, one of the inspirational members of Parliament, and one of the areas of work that Belle has particularly been involved in is around the campaign for reparations, which many of you will know is one of the absolute campaigns that Bernie was involved in. So, can I ask you to give a massive, massive welcome to Belle Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you very much, everybody, and good evening to you, and welcome to the House of Commons. It really is a privilege this year to be delivering the Bernie Grant Memorial Lecture. You know, we gather to honour the life, work and legacy of a man who helped to pave the path that many of us continue to walk, certainly myself. He was a giant of British politics and a community champion, and one of the most principled voices to sit in Parliament. And this is the late, great Bernie Grant, who sadly passed away 25 years ago today. It's not just a privilege, but it's also a responsibility to stand before you this evening. And I say responsibility because the work that Bernie began in Parliament and the broader reparations struggle he helped to shape isn't simply to be admired or commemorated. It has to be continued. And it's particularly wonderful for me to be delivering this in this particular room, because I used to work for Diane Abbott for a number of years, and one of the first things she ever let me organise by myself was a reparations event. It was huge, like this. A number of people filled the room, and it was in 2014, the year that CARICOM put down their 10-point plan. And needless to say, since then, I've been very, very engaged in the reparations movement. Now, my lecture today is entitled Recording Resistance, Bernie Grant, Anti-Colonialism in the UK Reparations Movement, and I want us to think seriously about what it means to record, to acknowledge and to preserve our history of resistance. Not just for the sake of the past, but for the present and especially for the future. For me, this is going to be a lecture about memory, about who gets remembered and how, and the systems and structures that prefer silence and the communities who keep speaking. It's also about the truth about colonialism, of racism, of injustice, and about those who fought and still fight to bring that truth to light. And I also want to speak about reparations, what we mean by it, what we don't, and why the fight is still ongoing. I also want this to stop echoing, so... It's this? Any better? Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Reparations for me is not just about money, and it shouldn't be for anybody. Though economic justice is a crucial component, it's ultimately about repair. It's about truth-telling, education, institutional change. It's about remembering what this country would rather forget and then acting on it. Now, Bernie himself didn't just make history as one of the first black MPs elected to the House of Commons in 1987. He was one of those fighters. He was born in Guyana, shaped by Pan-Africanism, elected in Tottenham, and his very presence in this house was a statement. His politics were rooted in the tradition of anti-colonial struggle. He was unapologetic about calling for reparations, not as a fringe demand, but as a necessary part of justice. He changed history by challenging its telling. He reminded Britain of the truths it so desperately tried to forget, the truths about empire. Oh, you can all hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Then we can get rid of that. And about colonialism, those truths about slavery, about the lasting debts owed to peoples of African descent and all that came after them. And one of his most courageous acts was actually the founding of the African Reparations movement at UK in 1993. He was the first person to bring the demands for reparations directly into British Parliament in the face of ridicule, ignorance and hostility. For Bernie, reparations weren't just about money, they're about honouring the legacy of resistance, the legacy of our ancestors who fought against enslavement, against colonialism, and who built the wealth of this country with their blood. The work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations, which I'm proud to chair, continues in Bernie's vision, but it also builds on the work of continuous community organisers, campaigners and everyday people who've never stopped resisting, who've always known that the fight for justice starts with recognising harm. So tonight, as we remember Bernie's fierce commitment to anti-colonialism, we remember his belief that the struggle for justice was both local and global, and I hope that we recommit ourselves to finishing what he started. So I'm going to take my lecture in 4 parts. I'm going to begin with kind of grounding ourselves in Bernie's life and work, particularly his anti-colonial politics and his foundational role in the UK reparations movement. Then I want to explore the broader anti-colonial tradition in Britain and how resistance has always been linked to global struggles, and focus on the Barling conference as well. Then I want to look at what's happening in the UK reparations movement today and the challenges that we're facing. And then finally, I want us to consider the importance of recording resistance, the need to tell our own stories, to preserve our own histories and to shape our own futures, and why this digital archive that's being launched today is so important. And I hope that by the end of this we'll leave not only with a deeper understanding of Bernie's legacy, but also renewing our commitment to continuing his work and challenging colonial amnesia and holding institutions to account. Now, if we are to understand what the current demands are for reparations in Britain, we have to begin with those who laid the groundwork, and few figures loom as large in this particular struggle as Bernie Grant. What distinguished Bernie was how he linked the struggles of Black Britons with global Pan-African and anti-colonial movements. He recognised that Britain's racial inequalities stem from the legacies of slavery, colonialism and empire, and that real solutions require us confronting that history, not relying on tokenism or colourblind policies. And he rose through the ranks of local politics, and in 1987 he was elected the MP for Tottenham, becoming one of the first 4 Black MPs elected to Parliament in modern British history, alongside Keith Vaz and Paul Barting and my great friend and mentor Diane Abbott. And in his time in Parliament, and even before he entered it, Bernie used his platform to challenge institutional racism and expose it as a systemic feature, not an anomaly. Crucially, Bernie didn't just talk about race, he talked about empire. He boldly named empire as central to Britain's racial issues. And as I said, in 1993, he founded the African Reparations movement in the UK, campaigning for justice for the descendants of enslaved Africans. And this was at a time when reparations were marginalised, but he still managed to bring them into Parliament. He attended that first Pan-African Conference of Reparations in Abuja, Nigeria, where the Abuja Proclamation was adopted, calling for reparations for Africa and its diaspora. And he also worked with Caribbean leaders to internationalise the call. Bernie didn't just demand justice, he offered concrete proposals: truth-telling, public education, a reparations commission, institutional reform, material investment in communities suffering from the legacy of colonialism as solutions. And for him, reparations addressed present-day realities such as housing, health, education, incarceration, and as the afterlife of empire. And despite being sidelined and misrepresented often, Bernie's legacy endures in the reparations movement and in our communities. Even after his death in 2000, the British establishment still struggled to fully recognise his contributions. Now, the Bernie Grant Arts Centre honours him, but the real tribute is continuing his work and recording his resistance. And above all, he taught us that Parliament is not the only place resistance lives, despite what some MPs will say, but it can and must be a site of struggle. And he made sure that for him, Parliament was a platform and not a pedestal, and I can't tell you how important that is. His courage meant that we didn't have to start from scratch. It's not lost on me that I am a member of the most diverse parliament we have ever had, that I get to lean on the support of people that came before me, like Diane Abbott, and that there are many other black MPs now. That's not lost on me at all. We have to remember who came before and the struggles they had to endure. So we're not starting from scratch. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations exists because of the path that Bernie cleared, and all of us actually walk in this path that he cleared, not just for him, but for all of those who fought and never saw the halls of power. So let us remember Bernie Grant as a strategist, a Pan-Africanist, and a visionary who dared to demand justice at the heart of empire. Now, when it comes to that anti-colonial struggle in the UK, and when we think of anti-colonialism, we often focus on liberation struggles abroad, such as Ghana's independence under Nkrumah, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, or the armed struggles of Mozambique and Angola. But anti-colonial resistance also lived here in Britain, on the streets of Brixton, where I'm from, on the steps of police stations, in community halls, and even in Parliament. As the heart of empire, the UK was also the site of resistance. And colonialism wasn't just out there. Its aftershocks, racism, inequality, surveillance were felt at home. Migrants from Africa, the Caribbean, and South Asia came as British subjects to rebuild a nation enriched by their labour, only to face hostility and exclusion. But they didn't stay silent, they organised and they resisted, and they did together. And that's a point I'll come to slightly later. Now, I think about people like Claudia Jones, deported from the US, became a key black British leader, founding the West Indian Gazette and the Notting Hill Carnival as acts of cultural resistance. The Black Power movements of the 60s and 70s, like the Black British Panthers and the Race Today Collective, developing their own critiques of British imperialism, challenging education, policing and deportation. This tradition continued into the 1980s, and when uprisings erupted across the UK in response to racist policing and economic neglect, from Brixton to Toxteth, from Handsworth to Tottenham, these were not just riots as they were framed by the media, they were rebellions, expressions of political consciousness that understood Britain's colonial present, not just its past. Thinkers like Stuart Hall gave language to these struggles, while grassroots activists demanded liberation, not assimilation. All of these movements shared one core belief, and that's British racism was structural and rooted in empire. Bernie's politics firmly belonged in this tradition. He brought the call for justice into Parliament without diluting its radical message. And though often erased from history, communities preserved their resistance through poetry, protest, radio, and oral storytelling. Now, there was something through all of this that we lost. And it's not often popular in spaces of African descent, but I don't always say popular things, but I remember that I came up under a movement working under the united banner of political blackness. Now, when we talk about political blackness, we're talking about more than a term. We're talking about a tradition of unity, a strategy rooted in solidarity between African, Caribbean, and Asian people here in Britain. It came out of necessity because whether you were from Jamaica, Ghana, India, or Pakistan, the racism you faced came from the same structures. And that doesn't mean they were all exactly the same, but it came from the same structures, the same schools that excluded our children, the same police that harassed our communities, the same media that dehumanized us. So we stood together on picket lines in community halls, outside police stations, from the Grumwick strike to the Mangrove 9. Our shared resistance was powerful because it was united. Political blackness reminded us that our struggles were linked, that we couldn't afford to be divided, and that truth still holds today. Because racism hasn't gone away, it's evolved. It shows up in hostile environment policies, in racialized health inequalities, in the school-to-prison pipeline, and it still tries to divide us. But we should know better. We should know that our strength is collective and that our liberation is bound together. That unity isn't just history, it's a necessity. And as we fight for justice, reparations, and real change, we must continue to stand side by side, because in Britain's civil rights struggle, we always have. So today's reparations movement isn't a new new idea, but a continuation of a long struggle that all peoples who have been subject to British imperialism should fight together. Now, it's one that links injustice to global exploitation and demands the transformation of every institution that was shaped by empire. And whether this is through educational reform or policing changes, this is all anti-colonial work, and the UK reparations movement cannot be separate from this history. It has to be a natural extension to it. There is a term that's often used to describe chattel enslavement of African peoples, and some of you may know it and some of you may not. It's referred to as the Mangamizi, which is a Swahili word meaning the African Holocaust or the Great Catastrophe. It's expressing that it wasn't just a crime of the past, but it is a living legacy. The Stop the Mangamizi campaign reminds us that consequences of this system are still with us. And so I'm talking about the underdevelopment of African and Caribbean nations, the displacement and dispowerment of black communities in Britain, and the systemic racism that permeates all of our institutions. I'm talking about the environmental degradation caused by centuries of imperial exploitation, the absence of truth and education about Britain's colonial past, and the understanding that the Mangamizi didn't end in 1834 with the so-called abolition of slavery. It evolved into colonial domination. Whips and metal shackles were replaced with other constraints, neo-colonial debts, structural inequality, state violence, a UN Security Council on which no African or Caribbean nation has a permanent seat, punitive and exploitative trade, continued theft and institutional racism, poverty, and I could go on. I think it's also very important that we are currently marking 140 years since the Barling Conference. And as you know, the Barling Conference is something that's known as the Scramble for Africa, where European nations got together, and between 1884 and 1885, they literally sat there and carved up the African continent. Now, what happened there continues to shape our world in ways we're only beginning to fully understand. The division of Africa amongst European powers without regard for the lives, cultures, or ethnic or cultural, political realities or histories of the people who lived there was extensive. Now, these artificial boundaries fragmented societies, they created ethnic tensions, and they set in motion a cascade of conflicts that persists to this very day. What happened there wasn't just an act of territorial rearrangement, it was an act of violence that echoes through generations. And it wasn't just about drawing borders, it was about power, control, exploitation. It was about claiming resources, land, minerals, even after having extracted hundreds of years of this through the transatlantic slave trade, and using this to fuel the economic growth of European empires at the expense of African lives. The systems of governance that countries are meant to be grateful for were imposed by colonizers. These were not designed to serve the people, but to serve the colonial powers. The legacy of these impositions, economic dependency and social fragmentation, continue today. And 140 years later, too many of us are told that the ills of their nations are entirely their fault. We are told that everything essentially that happens there is their fault. But worse still, we are told to forget. Now, we know that if there's anything we love in Europe, it's our history. I mean, look at this place. You would cry if you found out just how much of your taxpayers' money is used to keep this building just so. So to those who say that we should move on and forget, I have to ask, why are peoples of African descent the only ones asked to forget? Why are we the only ones expected to heal without justice, without recognition and without repair? Whilst we build monuments, have days, make movies about, pay respects to all other global injustices, we are asked to forget. Why should we forget when, from racism to economic inequality and climate breakdown, so many of the problems that peoples of African descent face today have their undeniable roots in these crimes against humanity? And we have to be clear that they were crimes because some would have us believe that they were mere moments in history. It's also important to recognize that the Barling Conference wasn't just an event that affected Africa. It was a key moment in the creation of the global order that we see today. The economic and political structures that emerged from the conference continue to shape international relations and global trade. Those power structures that were forged in Berlin are still in place, and they continue to extract resources, exploit labor, and perpetuate inequality. We see this every day in the way global power is distributed, how decisions are made by a small elite, far removed from the lives of those who bear the brunt of their policies, how the debt of developing countries is used as a tool for control, how international institutions shaped by colonial histories continue to serve the interests of the few rather than the many. This is why I thought it was important to reflect on the Barling Conference, not just as a historical event, but as part of a broader conversation about global inequality. It's about understanding how colonialism continues to shape the world and how we can work to dismantle those systems that perpetuate injustice. And that is why we need reparations, and why reparations is about so much more than money. So, what is reparations? Now, reparations are often reduced to a question of financial compensation, but this view is so narrow and misleading and a huge barrier to progress, because when people start talking about money, some people's minds just shut down completely. We always have to start, when we're thinking about reparations, I believe, with the premise that there are no amount of payments, no collection of acts that could ever fully recompense for the hundreds of years of enslavement, trafficking, genocide, ecocide exploitation, degradation, theft of natural resources, colonialism, deliberate underdevelopment, and forms of neocolonialism that persist today. There is no amount of payments and no collection of acts. Now, these crimes against humanity of enslavement and colonialism were too great, and the impact was too wide to reduce it to mere dollars and pounds. But it is a continuation of these crimes that have been committed if we seek to do nothing at all. And I would argue that the focus needs to be on the root of the word reparare. Now, reparations comes from the Latin reparare, and that literally means to repair. It is as much about repairing global power structures, moral and social equity, as it is about financial compensation. Reparations in their full sense would involve environmental, educational, economic, psychological, and spiritual repair. They would involve truth-telling and transformation. They are a necessary process to begin addressing the legacies of colonialism that continue to shape the present. And we have to be clear that the deliberate underdevelopment of Africa and the Caribbean did not happen in a vacuum. It was a deliberate outcome of European imperialism. I recently watched a debate of Caribbean students on reparations, and to quote one of these brilliant young people, they said slavery wasn't a glitch in the system, slavery was the system, it was the foundation of modern capitalism. The entire financial structure of the West, its banks, insurance companies, shipping lines, and stock markets were built on the backs of enslaved African people. They made us work for free for centuries, and then they said we weren't good with money. Do you wonder why there is such a huge resistance to correcting the narrative on enslavement and colonialism when you hear something like that? This is not only an indictment of historical hypocrisy, but a sharp critique of the continued stereotyping and systemic barriers Black people face in accessing economic justice. Now, in recent years, we've seen renewed momentum on reparations right across the world, and definitely in the UK's movement. And we've been able to work with forming the all-party parliamentary group on African reparations. Now, this was formed in direct response to campaigning by Stop the Mangamizi, a campaign which shares our secretariat with Afford. And now the APPG aims to promote understanding of reparative justice and advocate for policies that respond to the legacies of slavery and colonialism. We are able to bring a lot of people into this house in particular and discuss those issues. There are so many community projects at the moment that are also playing a critical role in documenting histories, renaming public spaces, reclaiming narratives, and providing education outside of state institutions. These acts are reparative in themselves because erasure is a form of violence and memory in itself is resistance. We've worked closely with campaigners and community leaders to push for a UK all-party commission of inquiry for truth and reparative justice, to support motions for local authorities to engage with reparations, including Lambeth and Islington and others, and to develop a wider reparations policy framework that recognises environmental, educational, cultural and psychological dimensions. We also call for proper engagement with the UN Decade for People of African Descent, which the UK has so far failed to honour. This work has grown from grassroots campaigns like the March for Reparations, which now sees thousands of people mobilising across the UK every year. The Mangamese, as I said, the term used for the African Holocaust has not ended. It continues through structural racism, environmental degradation and underdevelopment. So we have continued to do as much as we can to support efforts to decolonize public spaces. The resistance against the statues and enslavers of colonizers coming down isn't about erasing history. It's about telling the truth. It's about choosing which legacies we honor and which we refuse to celebrate. So supporting things like that. And we are also exploring how reparations intersect with other justice struggles. We need to think of reparations in so many different contexts. It was about the total extraction of wealth and opportunity and dignity from black people. So there's so many different dimensions. That means reparations could not even encompass just one single demand like money. It has to offer a framework of rethinking justice, redistribution and historical responsibility. And of course, it's not just a UK issue. Reparations are about a global movement. Across the Caribbean, the CARICOM Reparations Commission has led the call with a 10-point plan, the plan that we discussed in this house 11 years ago now, and it addresses apologies, repatriation, cultural institutions, health initiatives, debt cancellation, and these demands are directed at former colonial powers, in particular Britain. We have African nations and the African Union in particular this year calling for reparative justice, not just for slavery, but colonial looting and cultural theft, and the return of stolen artifacts, debt cancellation and climate reparations. Across Europe, cities and universities are beginning to confront their ties to slavery, but we have to really reject the empty gestures. Yes, it's important to go through processes such as plaques and renamings, but we need to understand that those are not enough. Reparations have to mean power and redistribution and an end to inherited injustice. And one of the huge focuses of the APPG is the return of artifacts and human remains. And quite recently, we had a report with a forward called Laying Ancestors to Rest. It was a very, very important part of our work to work towards stopping the sale of human remains and the display of them in our museums. I always say to people when I think of the so-called Egyptian mummies, could you imagine if somebody went and dug up one of our kings or queens, dug them up from their place of rest, took them to another country and put them on display? I'm sure we would all have something to say about that. And another aspect of the work we do is decolonizing aid, or at least trying to discuss decolonizing aid, because what is reparations not? Reparations is not aid, it is not charity, and it is not a handout. It couldn't possibly be aid, because we have to look at where our aid system or our overseas development has become. It has now become an institution, and what does every institution need? It needs supply and demand. Many of our aid agencies, and it's not to say they don't do some good work, but their model is built, as most ecosystems like that are, on actually creating more work for themselves and keeping their institutions funded. And if that's your model, there is absolutely no way that you can be working fully for the development of people from less developed countries. It just doesn't work, and that is a huge problem. So when we talk about decolonizing aid, I hope that there are more organizations that actually look into what they're doing more, because if these aid organizations do not have bringing themselves to an end as a strategic aim of their organization, then they shouldn't exist in the first place. Now, I wanted to touch on environmental reparations and educational reparations as an example of what we could do, because as I said, it's not just about money, it's about justice, and we need to confront those deep structural inequalities. Nowhere is clearer on this than the climate crisis. You've seen countries like Kenya and many across the Caribbean on the front line of a disaster that they did almost nothing to cause. Kenya, for example, is responsible for just 0.03% of global emissions, and yet it faces drought, famine, and ecological collapse. A few years ago, I actually went to Marsabit County, and I saw that devastation firsthand. People are losing their land, their livestock, their livelihood, not because they lack solutions, but because they're trapped in debt. In 2021, the year before, Kenya spent 5 times more on debt repayments than on fighting climate change. That's not just unjust, it's indefensible. Reparations has to be about cancelling debt and climate finance. We can't keep letting private creditors profit whilst the planet burns, because people are actually paying the highest price for this crisis, and they are the ones least responsible for causing it. Now, in terms of educational reparations, and the project being launched today is key in that. I, like many others, never learnt Black history at school. The majority of my learning and my love for reading meant that I took frequent visits to Brixton Library. I learnt about so many different things, but mostly initially the American civil rights struggle, and I actually want Black British children to learn about our Black British civil rights struggle. The Bristol bus boycotts, Claudia Jones, Olive Morris, CLR James. Now, those things are becoming more common, but they're still not embedded in our education system. Now those who don't think maybe it's necessary to learn Black history in school, or that it should be confined to certain lessons, should really acknowledge how damaging it is not to see yourself reflected in your history, and how if we don't learn about enslavement and colonialism, the impacts that they had, how we actually truly meant to learn why our country is the way it is today. Now, what we found out a few years ago, that the subject of Black history, or Black history being taught in schools, actually across 5 different petitions got more signatures than any other subject matter combined. But even with that, the former government refused requests from campaigning organisations to change the curriculum. And at that time, they also coupled that with a new guidance about anti-capitalist texts in schools, and that made me really, really suspicious, because I also didn't learn about the miners' strikes, the poll tax riots, or the achievements of trade unions in schools. And so when I talk about teaching Black history in schools, I always want to make clear that decolonising our education is every bit as much about class as it is race, because I always think that they really do think about what we are taught. We are taught what people want us to respect. We spend a lot of time learning about the Tudors and the Stuarts and some of the people in these paintings here. But, you know, heaven forbid that working class kids actually taught about movements for change. They might actually start to get ideas, realise that they have power, that when they see injustices, they should challenge it. And, you know, if they just persevere, that they might win. And I think that's really, really important in terms of how we are moving forward and teaching our young people. We have to be willing to inform as much as we possibly can. If we have to take that upon ourselves, then we do. Because I always say that no one is born racist. Racism is ignorance, and what is education if not the absence of said ignorance? And when we learn this Black history, it has to be done properly, because we're told so many lies about ourselves, or we're not told. Now, for me, people take a different view on this. A lie is also omitting the truth. That's my personal belief. It depends how some people take that. But it's important that we learn about our allies. In any movement, you have allies. So William Wilberforce, yes, was great. And what other abolitionists did to help the struggle was great. But far too often, we are erased from our own victories. And we have to understand that the transatlantic slave trade didn't end because Britain all of a sudden became benevolent. They ended because of the slave revolts. It became so economically inviolable to maintain the system of slavery that they had to bring it to an end. And then colonialism ended because people were no longer to have countries like our own rule over them. Again, they were the architects of their own change. And it's so important that when we look at reparations and how we're going to win in this movement, that we make sure that the demands are coming from those that are most affected. Because I think about how the slave trade ended, and how as soon as it looked like it was going to come to an end, what happened? Countries like ours said they were bringing it to an end. and so they took control of it. When colonialism was being brought to an end in different countries, what happened? Countries went over to hand over countries back to people, and sometimes in the case of Francophone countries, they would literally hand back the country, take a whole load of money for them, let them have everything above the ground and keep everything below the ground. If reparations is to be done properly, it has to be done on the terms of those that are most affected. Now, I always think it's important when making an argument to think about all of the arguments that people make against. So one of the arguments that I always hear is that slavery was a long time ago. Why should the current generations be held responsible? Or that reparations would be divisive. But is it divisive to tell the truth, or divisive to admit that our institutions, our banks, our universities, even our royal family was actually enriched by both enslavement and colonialism? Is it divisive to repair harm, all of those harms that continue to manifest in disparities in health, wealth and education? Denying reparations because the crimes against humanity were a long time ago is actually to deny the very real experience of those of African descent for whom impoverishment and racism continues to exist. Lest we forget that the entire social construct that we operate under without biological meaning existed because of enslavement. Race in itself, a human invented classification system instituted and enforced primarily for the justification of capitalism, to exploit or owning African human beings for the purpose of free labor, subjugation and theft. So in my view, that is ridiculous. Another thing I'm asked, and this one always gets me, is what about the Normans and the Saxons and the Romans, if peoples of African descent are going to get reparations, then there are white people in this country that should also get reparations from the Norman invasion and the Roman invasion. And I say, okay, if you show me anybody that suffers the effects of the Norman invasion or the Roman invasion today, please say, I will go and I will stand on their picket line with them and I will campaign for them also. But you do not see that. And I cannot imagine, somebody actually tried to argue with me a couple of weeks ago that this was the case and that white working class people were struggling with the effects or living the long-term effects of the Norman invasion and the Roman invasion. Yeah, and people make any argument that they want. And I would say that actually no, just like people in this country, they are also suffering the effects of capitalism. I think we should leave that there. Now, if governments like our own do not believe there's a reasonable claim for reparations, then I also say, why do they refuse to make an apology? One of the arguments is that we only apologise to our equals, and that's clear, we're not seen as equals, but the other is key because they've expressed deep regret, and I think about what deep regret is. I deeply regret that the skirt I was going to wear today didn't zip up at the back. I deeply regret all the times I used to steal pick and mix from Woolworths in Brixton. Surely the only sentiment for one of the worst crimes in history is an unequivocal apology. Sorry. So they've expressed deep regret, they've called it a stain on the nation's history, they've feigned every other form of apologising without actually apologising, a lack of respect, absolutely, but could it be that they recognise their culpability and like your average corporate body who's trying to avoid paying out something that is so blatantly their fault, they're going to great lengths to ensure that they do not use the recognised legal language for liability. They want to make sure that they do not admit fault, not because they don't believe they're not at fault, they do not admit fault because they know that they are at fault and they simply do not want to pay the price. We make so many arguments against paying reparations when there are so many different things that we could do to start today, but we refuse to look at them. And some of the things which are free, like giving some artifacts back. Now, another argument that I come up against constantly, particularly in this place, is that I should be grateful. People of African descent should be grateful because the UK abolished the slave trade. That the UK met what was a moral obligation, and actually done it mainly because those who were enslaved were beginning to revolt and it was becoming economically inviable. We should be praised in Britain for doing that. I would say whoever praised an arsonist for putting out their own fire. And anybody who suggests the abolition of slavery was a purely moral consideration has to come up with a very good answer as to why we compensated those who were enslaved and not. We compensated the slavers and not those who were enslaved, because that's what happened. We all remember that Britain took out the largest loan, the equivalent of 300 billion today, and that we only finished off paying off that loan in 2015, and they used that to pay the slave owners, not the enslaved. That means that me and many of you, if you paid taxes, which I hope you did in the past however many years, paid towards to literally enriching those that enslaved our ancestors. And it's the type of injustice that should really shock the conscience, and it underscores why reparations are not just morally necessary but economically justified. Not only have the government established that it was possible to pay reparations, even though they paid it to the wrong people, they've established that the funds actually exist in our present. And we have to remember that our society overall is one that's been organised around inheritance. We inherit wealth, we inherit income, we inherit culture, we inherit identity. Our nation's inherited assets, but for some reason, on this particular issue, we refuse to inherit liability. Another one that I've heard, and this may be the last one in terms of arguments against, is that Africans sold their own into slavery. So really it's all our own fault. Now, no one is saying that slavery did not exist. In fact, it existed all around the world. But to conflate that type of slavery with chattel slavery is absolutely wrong. Now, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles actually challenges quite well. And he really goes into why we should debunk that particular myth. He says, if I walk into your house and I murder your children and I burn your house down, and then 50 years later I say, well, you let me in, that doesn't exonerate me from my crime. That's how ridiculous the argument sounds when people try to push blame onto peoples of African descent for atrocities that were committed by European colonizers. Now, as I draw to a close, I want to talk about why actually reparations are in the UK's best interest, because people think, how could they possibly be? You're talking about taking loads of money away from us. But if we care about justice, if we care about democracy, if we care about truth, then we really have to take reparations seriously. It isn't just about righting historical wrongs. It's about healing the soul of this country. It's about building a society that confronts its past so it can honestly shape its future. Reparations are not just about peoples of African descent, they're about communities here in the UK as well, about persistent racial inequalities that we face in housing, employment, policing, health and education. These are not accidental, they are structural, they are the legacy of empire, and until we address the root causes of them, we're just going to keep treating the symptoms. Now, investing in reparative justice is an investment in social cohesion, truth-telling and democratic renewal. It's about dismantling a colonial mindset that sees people of African descent as forever marginal and forever exploited and forever silenced. And for those who do not succumb to the moral arguments for doing what is right, I have to make some economic ones for them. As governments right across Europe are pandering to nationalism, we would do well to remember that nationalism is not a uniquely Western concept. Many Commonwealth countries will only remember a past of exploitation and a present in which they are subjected to punitive IMF conditions, crippling their social infrastructure and serving the interests of the more powerful countries like the UK. Countries in the global south have their own nationalists, and every single one of them will tell you that their achievements are in spite of Britain's atrocities, not because of aid or the privilege of being colonised. And as we increasingly grow into a nation where, very soon a large amount of people are going to be over 65, the majority of the African continent will be young people. And I would say that I do not want to be on the wrong side of them as someone in this country. And I think we have to recognise that the world is changing. The world is changing, and whether we do this or not, Africa and the Caribbean will continue to rise, and they will do it in spite of us. So if reparations are about justice and justice demands truth, then it's so important that we record our resistance. It isn't just cultural, it's political, it's a necessity. And because the fight for reparations is also a fight over memory and about whose history gets told, whose voices get heard, whose pain gets recognised, we need to record that resistance. And for far too long, black resistance in Britain and resistance of formerly colonised peoples around the world has been distorted, silenced or erased. And that's why we must not only make history, we have to keep it. We have to protect those stories, the struggles, the strategies of those who refuse to accept the status quo, like Bernie Grant. We have to be clear that the British state has never been neutral when it comes to history. It built myths of civilization, of reluctant empire, of slavery as something that Britain nobly ended, not as the monstrous system it led and profited from. But our communities have always told another story. We've kept the memory alive through word of mouth, protests, banners, poetry, music, pamphlets, building our own archives when no one else would. And now we have to expand them, because recording resistance particularly matters in our increasingly digitised world. I'm sure everybody is thinking about AI at the moment, and if we don't hurry up and correct the mistruths that are out there about us on the internet, all that artificial intelligence is going to pick up is all of the lies that have been told about us in the past. We have to safeguard the memory of our struggles, because we live in a world that often likes to forget on purpose. And it legitimises the movement to show our struggle is part of a loud, proud tradition, from abolition to Windrush, from Claudia Jones to Bernie Grant. It educates, it helps build a decolonised curriculum, and it connects us across generations, across borders and across struggles. Recording resistance in itself is reparative, it's part of healing, and it's about replacing amnesia with accountability, and that is why this digitalised archive is so important. Now, I'm really pleased that we've now got to a place, and it has been difficult, because even now I talk about how Bernie was ridiculed when he first started to talk about reparations. You want to see some of the stuff I get in my inbox. But the reparations movement is growing, it's gaining strength. Young people, educators, community organisers, faith leaders, artists, international allies. It's a deeply intersectional movement. It's linking racial, economic, environmental and social justice. And the call for reparations, I believe, is actually rooted in love of our people, our history, and our right to dignity. It's not about guilt, it's about responsibility, and creating a world where peoples of African descent can actually live with dignity, security, and memory. Where we are no longer forced to carry the trauma of the past in silence, and where we can actually build institutions that reflect our own truths, cultures, and powers. Now, Bernie might have not lived to see reparations achieved, but he definitely lit the fire to this path. And as I look across this room, and some of you I recognise, activists, scholars, students, community leaders, I know that his spirit lives on. And I want us to be the generation that refuses to be silent. I want this to be the parliament that actually listens. And I want this country to be a nation that's actually brave enough to make things right. And people often say to me, how can I be so hopeful? I mean, not only am I a descendant of peoples who were enslaved and colonised, I'm actually a black woman, backbench MP on the left, so we live by hope. But we also... But I also live in the truth that this place once said that I could be owned, that I could be treated like property, and I get to stand in its halls under these photos of some people that may have once owned my ancestors and call for reparations. And you know, that has to be progress in itself. So I end with Bernie's words tonight, which were a call to action. We have a right to remember, a right to speak out, and a duty to act. So let us do that, and let us repair. Thank you.
I thought that was extraordinary, really extraordinary. I must admit though, Belle, I hadn't heard this one about the Normans.
It's brand new.
I mean the feistiness of it, basically. Anyway, we're going to move into a panel discussion, so we can pick up some of the issues that Belle brilliantly raised for us this evening. So I'm delighted to invite Kurt Barling to chair that panel. Kurt is an award-winning journalist, filmmaker, was one of the longest-serving black journalists, black presenters at the BBC. Now at Middlesex University, Dean with responsibility for research and knowledge exchange in arts and creative industries. Please welcome Kurt.
Well, my brain hurts after that talk about. There was so much going on there.
It was so long.
Well, no, didn't feel that long, to be honest.
I worried that I couldn't actually fill 30 minutes, but I think I went over.
Well, you made 20 minutes compressed. Look, I mean, one of the reasons we're here tonight is, apart from just to hear your words of wisdom, is to talk about Bernie's legacy. And of course, we started the evening by talking about the Bernie Grant archive and how Bishopsgate has curated and nurtured that archive. And it's one of the questions I want to ask you first, actually, how useful was that archive and the information within it to help you with your talk this evening? I'll come to that in a moment. But the reality is that activism needs to be led by evidence. And the reality is, if we're going to reframe the conversation, we need to be sure how we collect the evidence, the diasporic evidence, how we store that evidence, more importantly, how we disseminate it, and how we build what you're describing, a collective response. And the reality is, as dry as they may seem, archives are where we collect and store that evidence. And one of the great things in modern Britain is that there are communities, diasporic communities, who've taken upon themselves, because they know no one else will do it, to collect that evidence. The question now is, how do we utilize that to build and to support the reparations argument that you're making, the one that says we need to repair and heal our nation, and this is the only way we can do it. You'll notice, many of you, in front of you, if you can hold it up, Sophia, a sheet of paper which on it has a QR code. For those of you who are my age and don't understand what QR codes are, never mind. You can take out your phone and you can use your camera to read that QR code. And what it will do is take you to something that the Bernie Grant Trust has been working on with Middlesex University to create an AI search capability of that digital archive. It's unique, it's pioneering. I think Bernie would be looking down and smiling on us to know that his legacy, his archive, is doing some pioneering work with artificial intelligence. And the point about it is this: it is making what is a dry subject, it's making what is usually used by specialists accessible to all. We're starting a journey where the information, the intelligence in that Bernie Grant archive can be read by everybody. And we can help them to read it. We can help them to see the stories within, so that they can help tell those stories which do that repair work that Belle so eloquently talked about. So let me ask you first, Belle, how useful was that archive in helping you frame your argument this evening?
It was invaluable, and I was very pleased to have access to it beforehand. One thing that I'll always say when it comes to talking about reparations more generally is that every time I either have to speak about it or I'm at an event with other people, I always learn something. And I think that's the most important thing about this. As I said, we've been told so many different lies about ourselves. We've been told so many mistruths. There's so many things that have been hidden from us, that there is always room to learn more. And that lifelong learning of the histories that have been denied us as so key in actually understanding who we are. And in terms of reparations, it's actually making other people understand what is owed, what was done wrong, because some people to this day believe that it wasn't that bad.
Some people might think that you could go to Wikipedia and find out all about reparations, but
you'll find out something, but you won't find out as much as you will from this archive. You won't find out as much as about what has been done before. As I said, Bernie was the first person to talk about reparations in this house, but even he would always acknowledge those many people that came before him. The argument for reparations isn't new, just like our history isn't new. For some people, you would believe that our history started with enslavement, and even that there's not enough information about.
Machel, let me bring you in, because you have been on that journey from when Bernie passed so young. I say so young because I'm now older than Bernie was when he passed, and I feel, wow, you know, how was that possible that we lost him so young? But you, along with Sharon and the Bernie Grant Trust and the family, have tried to keep that legacy alive through the trust. How important has it been for you to ensure that the curation of that material is made available as widely as possible?
It's central. It's the critical thing. I think, you know, speaking on behalf of the trust, is the critical thing that we do is to make that, is to try and preserve that material, that archive, and give people the access to it as far as possible. That's the point of the website project, so to give that people more access. You don't have to visit Bishopsgate. It was one of Bernie's big things, actually, you know, why he was so interested in reparations, is why he was so interested in the art project, was this idea of being able to connect back to the past and understand those journeys to inform present but future, as Belle said in her speech. And that we felt that was the thing with the trust could do as the legacy to going forward, and that was a critical thing for us to do. So getting the archive together, not just to clear it from Sharon's house, but to make it available to people was vital, and should probably just acknowledge that the very original archivist who came over from Australia to start that work is in the room today. So we should shout out Joanne, who's here, who did all that.
Can Joanne stand up just so we can see?
Yes,
Well done, Joanne.
But it is vital. It's how do we help people, younger people coming forward, to understand what has gone before, to build on what has gone before, so that we can go forward and not get stuck in some sort of loop of repeat activity.
Amelia, of course, you've taken on the huge challenge of actually making this archive, which sits in a physical building in Bishopsgate, into something which we can all access online. What has the process been for you to try and create or curate a collection, an online collection, a digital collection, which is more accessible to all?
Good question. Well, I have to acknowledge Sharon Grant, who's the guiding light of the whole archive project, as well as the Bernie Grant Trust itself, who employed me to help digitise the archive. But from the very beginning, we sat down, and it is such a vast...
I can't hear you at the back, sorry.
Can you hear me? Oh, this is off. Sorry.
Let's try.
Can you hear me now? Hi. So at the beginning of this project, we looked through pretty much all of the material that's housed at Bishopsgate Institute, and thought about what are the most significant pieces or the really key themes from that archive that demonstrate not only Bernie Grant's work in advocating for so many people, especially marginalised groups, throughout his career, but also what does it tell us about that particular period of political activism in Britain, the late 20th century, and how can it be utilised by younger generations who are still grappling with pretty much all of the same issues, whether it be the reparations movement or housing or employment or general racism in Britain. How can this material help to guide young generations and answer really vital questions. And as Belle outlined, it's so difficult when this history of political activism has been erased and hidden from us. As young people, we have no, how do we know where to go from here without any kind of example to follow? And so that was, I think, a lot of the point behind digitising this material, was that it should be accessible to all and democratised, but also, it's for a specific purpose, which is to help build on all of these issues that Bernie and a lot of other people in this room were working on many decades ago. So we decided to look at some key themes, including reparations, the trade union movement, challenging oppressive policing practices, internationalism, and how Bernie and others were linking up with people in Africa and the Caribbean and Asia and Europe around all of these same issues that were happening in multiple places. So that was the basis of it. And archives, as many of us know, are traditionally quite, gatekeeping institutions. Unlike Bishopsgate Institute works very different from other traditional archives, but usually, not everyone can access an archive. You might need to prove that you're a university student or a PhD student. Generally, they're not publicly accessible. So, and Kurt, because you've been involved in, or you've pioneered this AI project as well, that this is about ensuring that as many people as possible have access to the material, which has hitherto been hidden and really difficult to access. So we have to...
I want to acknowledge in the room, because Amelia speaks well, and she was schooled by somebody who made it his business to try and get the university system to recognise that black history was not just a legitimate but an essential subject, and he's suffered a bit from it. Hakim Addy is in the room. Professor Hakim Addy. What's quite interesting here is that Sharon mentioned to me that the archive was being digitised, and I thought, yeah, that's a great idea, but how do we make it more accessible? And about 8 weeks ago, something like that, we had a little meeting, and I said, you know what you need to do? You need to, I said it super confidently, by the way, we need to build an AI back end for this so that anyone can use the archive. And then I went to my colleague, Professor David Winbridge, who's here with us today, and I said, can we actually do that? And he said, of course we can do it. And in 8 weeks, we have built, with the help of Dr. Sophia Dakopoulou here at the front, an AI system which works with this archive. It means it is properly interrogatable. It means that anyone who is literate from the age of 5 onwards can ask a question that's interesting to them and get an answer from the Bernie Grant archive. That's not Wikipedia, that's not Google, that's not ChatGPT, it's the Bernie Grant archive. The challenge, I think, is that it's just one small archive. There are many other archives which we need to help on that journey. And I think that I know you dropped the word AI in there very carefully. What was your thinking on the question of how we utilize AI to liberate those diasporic stories, which so often you didn't hear about in school? Trust me, I definitely didn't hear about it in school. How do we liberate those stories from those archives using AI, do you think? Because most people are pretty skeptical about it, but you sounded quite optimistic.
Well, I think we can't be skeptical about something it's going to happen anyway. So many things are going to change for us over the next couple of years. In fact, they already have. So rather than being skeptical and being scared that the robots are going to kill us, I think we need to get on board, and we need to make sure that we are correcting the record, because we've got this archive digitalized. There are some other bits of information, but if you were to ask AI at the moment certain questions about us and our history, the answers you would get back would be incomplete, and they would actually be based on information that sadly is untrue and actually paints us in an awful light. So I'm actually hopeful because with digitalizing archives like this, we can actually begin to spread and share the true story of our resistance, the true story of the true history of what happened. Actually, the true history of what happened before enslavement began. I know that there are some fantastic teachers out there, again, doing this off their own backs because we're not given a proper curriculum in schools, who are actually making sure that when they do teach Black history, they're not starting with enslavement, they're starting with information about people like Mansa Musa, people such as that, just to make sure that everybody understands that our history did not start with people going to our countries and countries of origin and removing us, and impoverishment and enslavement. There was actually African history before Europeans arrived on the shores of Africa.
Amelia, you've seen the AI now. You've worked tirelessly for nearly a year to get the digital working, the digital site working. In your view, how much difference do you think, from an accessibility point of view, AI makes, given what Bella's just said, that it's important that we try and embrace it?
I think so much so that it's hard to quantify at the moment because we all do it. You know, anytime we have a question, Google is our first point of call now. And whereas years ago we would have had to trek to a library, or maybe perhaps we wouldn't have even had certain questions that we do now because it's so hard. It would have been harder to access that information. Now, people can ask a question about Bernie's work or the reparations movement, or like Labour Party black sections, and immediately get evidence. As you say, it's not only an answer; it's based on what is in the archive, which is so invaluable that it's not I can't describe it at the moment. And this is why it's so exciting today, because we won't know how people are going to use this material, but it's going to be really interesting to see as the months go by, what people pick up on from the archive, especially how it's utilised by young people who are so adept at using AI and anything digital. So yeah, just the possibilities of it are really exciting.
Machel, Bernie was a movement builder. He wanted to build movements. And you talked about building a reparations movement. The archive is doing something really pioneering, but it's going to rely on building a collective movement with other archives to liberate the diasporic stories, not just the Bernie Grant-inspired diasporic stories, but the diasporic stories from other archives. Is that something you think that the Trust can support and help develop?
Oh, I think more than support, I think it's something we want to champion. Sorry, I think not just support, I think we want to champion. And what I think Ashan was alluding to earlier on, that we're keen to talk and work through with any other archives how we might be able to do that collectively. I think that the sort of ideal is the ability for somebody to, as Amelia's saying, approach an archive resource of some kind and treat it like Google and tap questions in and get this evidence back. I think it's a real opportunity, if we can embrace it, to do the thing which, I must say, Kurt, I disagreed with you. As a historian by training, the idea of archives being dry, I really bristled. I bristled at that. I was looking around the room at the other historians going, what do you mean dry? Yeah, dry. But for some people they are, but having this type of way of approaching an archive can open that up, make them more interesting, make them more responsive, which is not a word, even as a historian, I would use about an archive, to make them responsive. And I think, so we can think about how we can do that, and then there's scope for us to, I think, to also start to think through what is an archive, and start to challenge that notion of what is an archive and what is a site or a place where knowledge can be held and where it exists. And AI is a real opportunity for us to do that.
I can see a world in which black diasporic archives join together and create a wealth of data which, by the way, when we're talking about the large language models, we're talking about they're relying on data, most of the data which has nothing to do with black folk, right? But if black folk own the data and they come to the large language models and say, by the way, we've got the data you need to stop the bias in your systems, they're not going to refuse an offer, are they? And by the way, they'll have to pay for that data, which means that suddenly the data liberates the story, takes it to another level. But that's going to require a real movement.
100%, and that requires collective action. And if Bernie was a movement builder, you're absolutely right. And he always wanted to be thinking about how we do that together. And that's what we require. And if they start paying, maybe we can come back to Bell and say, you can start putting numbers on it now.
Does that sound good to you, Bill? Putting numbers on it, getting them to pay, and we can take this whole activity to a point where you start the repair that you are so desperately wanting to see done.
Absolutely. For me, it would count as educational reparations, a way in which we are correcting the record and teaching and having accessible to everybody, whoever they are right across the world, the truth. Because so much of what we face at the moment is literally just because of how the story has been told. So it makes a massive difference. And that's why I suppose it's so... And I understand why a lot of the time we look at money, because any sort of legal claim, you have to look at financial elements to it. But that's why when it's reduced to money, I think it's so wrong, or reduced to just money. Nobody's saying that at some point in time financial reparations shouldn't be paid, but it has to be about so much more than that, because you can't just throw money at a situation and then hope it changes. This is what has been done in some cases with aid, and actually all it's done is ended up being recycled back into countries like ours.
So if the large language models like sort of OpenAI pay for the data, that's a form of reparations. I
think it is a form of reparations, and they should be invested in making sure that their data sets are accurate. They have to be accurate. If they're not, then what are they selling to the rest of the world?
Very good. Thank you all for being on the panel. Do you want to wrap this whole session up?
Can we thank the panel? Yeah, just a kind of quick reflection before I say a few final words. I think Belle put this brilliantly in her contribution. What we're in is a real, genuine battle about memory and about what that means. Because for too long they tell us that we should be grateful and all of that, as Belle said, but they also kind of steal our victories from us. Because, we liberated ourselves from enslavement, but you would never think that. When you look at history, it's out of the goodness of their hearts, somebody woke up one morning and decided this slavery business needs to go. It wasn't anything to do with us and our ancestors who fought and got killed, many of them, for having the audacity to want freedom. And if we don't build that memory bank, they'll steal these ideas from us, they'll steal this resistance from us again, because far too often you would have all have seen this, our victories turn into, well, it was their idea in the first place. I've been a campaigner for black self-organisation all my life, but they wouldn't have, some of the things they used to call us in those years, there's people in this room who would have heard some of these things. We were apparently in favour of things like, we were in favour of apartheid within the Labour Party. Of all the things to say to black people, to black activists, but that's what they used to say. They used to say that we weren't serious politicians, that we were dividing the movement, we were dividing the class. And we should just be grateful for whatever little crumbs they threw from the table. And unless we grasp that memory, and build these archives, then it will still continue to be their idea, their victory. And I'm not in for that. Are you?
No.
I can't hear you. Are you in for that? No. Right, so we have to do something about that. And one of the things that we can do is build this archive, but also please support the Bernie Grant Trust to continue that work as well. So I think you've all got this leaflet with that. I mean, I'd forgotten this was a pencil drawing. I mean, I just think that's extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? But if you look on the back, there's a QR code. I'm with Kurt. Right, QR. What is that? But apparently, if you get your phone out, then you can take a picture of it and you can get in and donate money. I'm asking you sincerely, please consider donating some money so that the Bernie Grant Trust can continue our work. But also, you've got an opportunity with these documents that you've got in front of you to have a look at the website. One of the things that we've been finding out, even since we've been setting up this gathering this evening, is the number of people who've come back to us and said, we've got more information, we've got more data, there's a whole bunch of stuff in my living room that I didn't know what to do with. Well, you know what to do with it now. But also have these conversations with other folks within the community as well, who are maybe not here tonight, but are also going to have this information, who are going to be able to add some really, really vital information about what really happened during those years that Bernie was campaigning, what really happened in those years before Bernie was campaigning, all those years of us trying to stand up and make our voices heard. One of the things that we hear, a little phrase that we hear quite often is that about being the voice of the voiceless. I disagree with that, actually. I think it's the voice, because I think we're the voices of people who they would not rather hear about. They would rather not hear our voices at all. At all. So our job is to make sure that our voices are not just heard, but it's acted on as well, and that they can never, ever shut us up. And the way they can never shut us up is if we build these archives, if we make sure that our story is the dominant story, that our story is not one that they've manufactured out of the goodness of their heart on our behalf, because that's what they do all the time. But it's our story from our mouths, from our experiences of the racism that many of us have experienced for far too long. The only way that we win is when we stand together in the unity that Bell absolutely hit the nail on the head. We don't do anything separately. We won't win separately. We won't win as individuals. We might win the occasional battle here and there. But where we will really win is when we're in unity with each other, where we build those movements that are really going to make the difference. Because I think if history teaches us anything, whether it's through enslavement or through the anti-colonial movements that we've all read about where we can, the thing that we learn the most is collective action, collective organisation that really brings about the fundamental change. And we still need that change today. So can I ask you once again to please thank Bell Ribeiro-Addy. And can I ask you to thank Bell Ribeiro-Addy properly this time with a lot more noise? Because thank extraordinary contribution, thank you so much, and thank Kurt. And Machel. And Amelia, who's done some outstanding work. Can I also ask you to thank Sharon Grant, a brilliant secretary. And finally, can I ask you all to thank yourselves for all the work that you're going to do to build this movement. Thank you so much. Safe journey home, folks, and remember to do that QR thing, whatever it's called. Do that. Thanks, everyone.